Well, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Brittany Greenfield, CEO and founder of Wabby. And today we're going to be talking about sort of, really the future of DevOps. A lot of your organizations, most organizations, have gone through this transformation. And the next step in it is really about application security. So we're going to talk about how we get there and some of the challenges along the way that most organizations are facing today. If any of these resonate with you, you're certainly not alone. But we can't talk about the future of DevOps if we don't, look a little bit at the history of it. We really want to go back to it. We've got to start with the scientific method. Obviously, Sir Francis Bacon popularized it, but this goes back to ancient times. I mean, we're talking stone tablets, and I don't mean Fortran. It's really about the process of an inquiry, coming up with a solution, and iterating. And when Bacon formalized the scientific method, that was that first step towards DevOps. We then saw the 1920s, on the heels of the Industrial Revolution, really start to apply this into more commercial businesses at scale, starting with the Seward cycle, which really just three simple steps: specification, production, and inspection. Deming then expanded upon that with 5 steps, which then got reduced into 4, and then became popularized at the end of the 50s as the PDCA: plan, do, check, act. And then you would iterate on that to a number of times. Starts to look a little bit like our CI/CD pipelines. This carried us through until the 1980s. Where systems thinking really got us thinking both about the internal and external implications and how we would iterate on it. And that could take any form, whether, thinking about how to optimize for a parking lot and leveraging the stores in a retail environment for that, could go to very complex for any of those that have done any operations training, very complex diagrams, but it was really about understanding the overall input and output. And it's not surprising the fact that this happened as we saw massive advances in technology and massive advances in the number of iterations we could produce. So for a while, this sort of carries us through, and then we hit, the millennium. Toyota comes out with the Toyota Way, same year as the Agile Manifesto. Then in 2003, Google introduces their SRE matrix. And then, 2004, Gene Kim's first book, for the first time as part of this, is we see, hey, ops, I'm part of this picture in development, with the simple title, Visible Ops. And finally, in 2008, we land on DevOps, right? We have the big moment of saying it's not enough for dev and ops to sit in separate silos. If the two are working towards the same goal, they've got to be aligned in a similar process. 2010 brought the Phoenix Project, Gene Kim's second book, which really popularized it. And here, by 2015, less than a decade later, we've got 75% of organizations using some form of DevOps. They're now in the panacea of flow, feedback loops, continuous improvement. So here we're sitting in 2021, and what would you think? You would think that those 75% that are using some form are like crushing it. But the reality is 62% are stuck in their DevOps journey, with only 15% of them feeling that they have any maturity to their DevOps. So why is this happening, right? That's the question people are asking. They've spent a lot of money, time, both fiscal and physical resources in deploying DevOps, but they haven't gotten that full benefit that we all know comes with it. Productivity, right? Deming identified this very, very early on. It's about productivity, efficiency, right? It's all very natural human things to understand a little bit of work and better coordination up front. And it means better results down the line, not just in terms of delivering code to market faster, but also from overall operational efficiency benefits, contributing to a company's competitive advantage. And in short, it's because of Conway's Law. For those that aren't familiar with Conway's Law, it states that any organization that designs a system will produce a design whose structure is a copy of that organization's communication structure. And we haven't fixed our system design for development. In other terms, Conway's people, I remember probably about a decade ago, but I don't know if this has changed much, right? But this is what Conway's law really is. And so when you don't have that structure, including all participants, then you're actually not able to capture the full benefits of DevOps or any process, because if you still have siloed information, in the case of DevOps, that's our cybersecurity managers. Then you're not going to be able to actually get it. So development, security, they all realize that. Development says, we're not mean girls. You can come sit with us. And that's the birth of DevSecOps over the last less than even decade. And people go, this is great. Security is now a piece of us. But the reality is, and 60% of organizations will have embedded DevSecOps processes this year alone, right? So great, we're making great progress. But the reality is all we've done is what happened was, like other DevOps tools, security then came in and said, oh, we've got a tool to go secure this DevOps tool. We are now part of DevOps because somebody said security is in the middle of DevOps. Great, we're now part of the team. And so while 60%, I'm just going to flip back on that, right? 60% of rapid development teams have DevSecOps practices embedded this year. The reality is that 84% report that it's too challenging because of that DevSecOps hairball, right? Those tools that where 43% have between 11 and 20 AppSec tools, and 22% have between 21 and 50 AppSec tools in use, right? That's too many, because everybody said, oh, DevOps is about automation and integration and tooling. Let's just buy more tools. But that wasn't the right approach. So we've left our teams, both our development and security teams, awash in data without any real information about how to deploy application security as part of their DevOps pipeline. And there's a reason, right? So most of our expenditures are now going towards people or solutions, and instead of services to actually deliver or that security into the pipeline. So if we go back to sort of the core tenets of DevOps being about automation and integration, and we're not doing this if we're putting the onus on people. And so what we're going to see, and this is why the future of DevOps includes application security, we're going to see that paradigm shift by 2027, where solutions will always be an important part of it, but those will start shifting to be about application security strategy as part of their DevOps strategy. And solutions will handle the actual deployment of application security itself instead of relying on being resource intensive, whether it's through a third party or your own team that's working on back office applications. And we know when you have resource intensive processes, it leads to high turn rates, burnout, and decreased productivity. So basically what anybody who's been saying we're doing DevSecOps though without any of the stuff that actually makes it DevOps. Right? We're still, and don't feel bad if your organization is in this camp, right? We're still in the world of application security by Excel spreadsheet or Confluence or Jira, or even worse, just institutional knowledge. I can't tell you how often I hear from prospects and customers, well, we've got a policy that says use a password. The reality is that they know the right password to use based on the context, but that's not actually encapsulated in any formal way that can be deployed as part of a program. So why aren't we actually doing DevSecOps the right way? This leads to, and we'll come back to that, but right, when we're not actually leveraging all the core tenets of DevOps and deploying DevSecOps, we're not actually getting the benefits of security. And so companies are still pushing vulnerable code, and they know it. They don't know what that code is always, and whether it's actually meaningful to them. And so this is like saying, I've got all this big security program, right? Here I have my 11 to 21 tools or my 21 to 50 tools, and we're creating all these opportunities for adversaries to get in through our code. 9 out of 10 breaches begin due to defects in code. And it's not saying that all vulnerabilities need to be fixed before code gets shipped, but rather understanding which ones are most critical to your specific business. Right, and the reason we've created this is CISOs understand, right? At the end of the day, our organization's goals are to ship code and ensure that it creates a competitive advantage in market. And security is still being seen as an impediment to speed to market. Now, let's look at the flip side of this. You know, I actually think security often gets sort of the short end of the stick. Ooh, right? And I know I've made fun of the DevSecOps hairball and all. Ooh, shiny new tool. Let's go buy a tool to secure our DevOps tool. But the reality is that we can't just automate the security tools and all those pieces in the hairball and say we've got DevSecOps. Because what the challenge and what makes application security unique is that there are constant changes going on. Let's think just about the DevOps side. The true goal of DevOps and a CI/CD pipeline is that word continuous. Continuous is about ensuring that your code that you ship, your applications, are continually meeting the current needs of the business. So you may change your feature prioritization. You may change the database that you're on. You may change where this is getting deployed, right? Those are all internal changes that are constantly going on. You may even change what kinds of bugs you care about based on customer demand, right? So you've got all these internal changes going on that the application security team needs to be able to manage and respond to, and they don't always have real-time information. And then they also have external changes happening, right? Threat intel, current compliance standards, just trying to evolve their program to meet and match the most current needs of the business. And so that's why just applying, like taking and photocopying the DevOps blueprint to application security has not worked. And it's left organizations behind, not just in integrating security, but on achieving the full benefits of their full DevOps program. So to be able to move forward in our DevOps evolution and get out of that rut that 62% of companies are stuck in deploying DevOps, we've got to go back to basics, right? Let's go back to that utopian view of DevOps that focuses on flow, feedback loops, and continuous improvement. When we get back to our core pillars of DevOps, we can then ensure that application security plays a successful part in our overall DevOps transformation. And it doesn't have to be DevSecOps anymore. It's just security as part of DevOps, like no different than QA or anything. So let's start with flow. Flow. This is the most important part, right? When you focus on the application security process instead of the tools, you can start to marry it with your DevOps process. It may not, unfortunately, this Excel spreadsheet checklist or some variation of automation a lot of companies have built in-house to certify that something has the authority to operate, is permitted to be released by security, has gotten people into a very binary, static, siloed view of where application security exists. Good application security is no longer just about pen testing or vulnerability management, and it's about a full process. And so you need to focus on what your application security process is, from how you assign what policies need to be followed for a specific application. Not all policies have to be followed for all applications, right? Because you have different risk tolerances and how that aligns with your overall business risk. to what the notification workflows are, what the control schedule is, how you actually verify that these things are happening, right? Flow is it's the most basic of it all. You don't sit down, you didn't, when you did your DevOps pipeline, sit down and go, I'm just going to integrate a database and an infrastructure layer, and things are just going to magically happen. You sit down and you think about how you're going to originate the idea of a feature to how you're actually going to ship it and then monitor it when you ship it. That's where you have to start your application security process and get out of that mindset of just thinking about the vulnerabilities and the risks. How do we make decisions based on what our perceived security risk is as part of our overall business risk? The second is those feedback loops. This is actually where, the shift left, security by design, security at speed, where all of those best of intention premises of the DevSecOps, revolution came out of, and it was the opportunity to provide early and often feedback. However, when we had a tool-based mindset, that just meant we were creating impediments to shipping code by slowing down and not knowing the right times to stop, as well as just creating more and more silos of data that had to be processed. This is how we get to almost half of organizations regularly shipping vulnerable code. In a healthy DevOps pipeline that has security integrated into it, you have the right tolerances, and based on the actual application concerns when to slow down, what the right times are. Because let's remember, DevOps is not just about speed, it's about efficiency. People have heard me say, the move fast and break things mentality is wrong, right? It was best of intentions when Facebook popularized that. But good DevOps is about efficiency, and efficiency means picking times to slow down and fixing things before they get worse. We do this with our bugs. Now it's time to do it with our application security. And that doesn't always mean testing. You can ask developers who often feel left out of this process or that they don't have the knowledge, give them the information at a ticket level perspective, and give them the ability to provide feedback on whether or not they follow that policy. This is a pretty common, or ask even their teammates, right? Think of it as the pull request at various stages. Sometimes it's going to be automated, sometimes it's going to be manual. And then we have to really think about the ability of security to have a continuous improvement function. When policies are being sent out in Excels and PDFs once a quarter, and maybe there's training once a year, you're not actually giving security the ability to evolve and adapt, not just to their needs, but to the development organization's need. I'm going to go back to that idea of the CI/CD pipeline. It's about continuous improvement and continuous deployment, being able to make changes to your applications and your pipeline so you can meet the current needs of the business and do it frictionlessly, right? You don't hold your breath for quite as long when you make one of these changes anymore, right? Because things are going to keep shipping. So how can we adopt this continuous security mindset where it's not just about being reactive to the changes that development's providing, but allowing security to bring in their knowledge and their strategy from the outside world to say, hey, here's a better policy. When you really get that marrying of your organizational structures, which is what DevSecOps should have been about, you can start to deploy a continuous security mindset. So what does this actually, if we take these three tenets of DevOps and start to think about security's role in it, what does this actually look like? Well, in a healthy organization that's thinking about first the flow of application security, not just the tools, we have the opportunity at the beginning of every project to categorize this, right? Some organizations do it through threat modeling. Others just say, we know this is a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 kind of application. Most fall somewhere in between. You, as a development organization, not just a PM, not just a developer, not just an architect, know the overall attributes of your project, of your application, and know that those marry to specific security policies. So when you can categorize that application at the start, right? Because good application security starts when an application is just a twinkle in an eye. You start thinking about the security, then no different than you start thinking about the architecture. You'll be able to categorize that profile to say, we don't have to boil the ocean on security. Here's the part of security that is important to us and how we're going to treat those vulnerabilities when they come in, or those issues when they start to happen. Who needs to sign off? What needs to happen? But before we get to that point, we've got to inform people, right? We've got to find a way to actually implement and this security profile that's been assigned to the application. That means sharing with all stakeholders. You know, there's been, and I'm sure most folks on this webinar have heard it, there's been a big trend in developer-led security. Well, good application security is about all the stakeholders. We don't have, you know, in our DevOps pipelines, we have unit testing, but we don't just put that all on the developers. We still have QA engineers, and different people handle different pieces of that. So application security needs to make sure all the stakeholders are getting in the information they need, whether it's the architect seeing in his ticketing system that, you know, what the actual configuration needs to be, right? Because anything that touches the application today is part of application security. Sharing with the developer what policies they need to follow specifically for that feature. You know, front-end developer doesn't need to know back-end API policies, right? Let's focus on the short attention span of us as humans to say, here's what you need to do, so, right? And those are just coding practices about security. Or even just telling the application security manager, hey, this project has come online. You are responsible for it. Here is the test schedule and the tools and what's going to happen with this, and the people that you need to do it, rather than at the beginning just saying, hey, we're going to contact you in 8 weeks, right? Let's make sure the stakeholders have their information. And then this is where we can start to create those early feedback loops, because if we've thought about this as a flow, there's then a process as we share this information and start to get feedback on it, whether it's just a developer attesting to saying, hey, I did not follow this policy, or a control going out and checking that the policy wasn't followed. It could be a SaaS tool, it could be a linter, whatever it is, and bringing those feedback loops in at the right time and saying, what are our tolerable limits, right? Some may be allowed, right? A PM may say, that's okay. It's fine that the policy is not being followed. But we ship imperfect code every day, not to ship bad code, but to make sure we're aligning our efforts with the goals of the business. And that's where, as those results start to come in, we need to assess them contextually based on that project profile. What is that security profile, and what does each vulnerability mean for this, right? We talked about the fact that 48% of companies are shipping code with known vulnerabilities. Some of that, a lot of that actually, is because you can't fix all the vulnerabilities. If we tried to fix every vulnerability in the world, it would take 6 months to ship Hello World, and then it would be insecure by the time we shipped it. Right? So we've got to understand what vulnerabilities matter for this particular application. You can imagine at a bank, right? One of our customers, they have a bill pay platform and a trading platform. When a medium availability vulnerability comes back on both of those, they have different business risk tolerances for those, not just cyber risk tolerances for them. You know, if a bill pay platform goes down for 10 minutes, it's not great, but you don't have compliance risk. You have other redundancies in place because, again, application security is about more than just the code, but anything else that relates to the deployment of the application. You know, it's a brand issue, so maybe you don't like those kinds of things. But if that trading platform gets an availability vulnerability exploited for even just a minute, you know, that's millions of dollars. That's a lot of time with the SEC, right? So you've got to be able to have some way to ship your code knowing where you've accepted risk on your vulnerabilities and where it's not permitted. And that's where we get into the ultimate authorization, right? When you've implemented these the flow, and you know what's supposed to happen when, and you have these small feedback loops. By the time you get to the ultimate security go, no go, thumbs up, you're getting away from that Excel spreadsheet to say, hey, does everybody sign off on it? I think we followed this policy. Maybe we didn't. I think we're okay here, right? We stop asking those questions and knowing with certainty where we have accepted risk and where we need to fix it before we ship it, because we have operationalized the overall application security program. And then this finally allows us to get into that continuous improvement mindset. Monitoring as part of an overall application security program within your DevOps pipeline should not just be about bringing new logs in and your control schedule. That's important. We even get into, you can be in a healthy stage today because you accepted that risk on vulnerabilities for a certain period of time, but you've now aged out on that. But really, it gets back to that original concept of security both wants to be able to evolve with your DevOps pipeline as you're making changes to it, and being able to push out the most security standards, whether it's because of a change to your application itself or a change to a policy, as well as being able to respond to their external environment. Retailers have a different availability tolerance for their web applications and supply chains in November than they do in February. Can you imagine if you can start taking this dynamic approach to security that starts to actually align with your DevOps program? Retailers, I've worked with them for years and their development teams, right? You have a shutdown of all IT ahead of even the busy season. And so why don't we deploy security as part of that? And when you've taken this approach to application security as being just another part of your DevOps platform on those core tenets, and with flow, let's go back to it, remember, right? Flow, feedback loops, and continuous improvement, then you can actually integrate security, because you're not just focused on trying to integrate the tooling, you've successfully integrated the process. And that will allow you to capture the full gains of your DevOps transformation and get out of the rut that you're in. We're here at the half hour, and I want to leave some time for some questions. I'm going to go ahead and pop this up. Let me open up the chat. Give me a second. So one question that we've got in is do I have to have a full DevOps transformation in order to actually start integrating security? Well, the reality is you don't. It's easy to talk about DevOps and CI/CD as being this, big lofty goal. And it's a little philosophical. Sometimes it can get a little ivory tower. The reality is that most organizations are living somewhere in between. I've heard, agile falls, water scrum, all sorts of things that we have sort of triangulated the pendulum. And, I always hate referencing this quote. It's like a quarter of teams ship code weekly or more frequently, which is great. It's the right thing for your company, but the reality is that a lot of organizations actually still do want to be on a release cycle, especially the larger your enterprise is. You may ship code to QA environments frequently, but you're still going to go through a monthly or quarterly release cycle to make sure you have your documentation in place. So you do not need to have a, CI/CD to actually implement continuous security. It's about understanding the process and saying whatever our process is, whether we are shipping code 7 times daily or we're still on a 2 releases a year cycle, and saying where does this align and how, as I make changes, because even if you are releasing still just twice a year, you're still making changes as you go along, how can I make sure my security can keep up with it? And that's that marrying of security and development, and how you actually get to the panacea, not just by shoving security in the middle of DevOps. All right, second question. Yes, great point from one of our attendees, right? As long as an organization has a secure software development life cycle, right, as a process for how you get code out the door, then AppSec can be continuous. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing that. I could not agree more, right? If you have a process, you can make sure security is an ongoing, continuous part of that. Another question that's just come up is, is there a good way, somebody sort of pointed to that assess component. Is there a good way to start to assess, create that profile and reassess those scores, right? Vulnerabilities talk about how bad they are in the world of vulnerabilities, not how bad they are in your organizations. I give the example of a bank. And so, first, I think you do have to start with understanding what your project profiles are. As I said, you can start just as simply as saying, we have a type A, type B, or type C, or tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. You do not need to get to very granular hierarchy there. But just have some concept of what are your project attributes, and how do those map to security standards, right? And remember, security standards are different than just your framework standards or your compliance requirements. Frameworks and compliance are things you have to do. Security standards are how you actually choose as an organization to marry those with your overall business strategy and risk, and how to actually tell people just to do it. So when you come up with those profiles, you can actually then start to use, and I often go to this as an example ourselves, right? The NIST CVSS calculator, and we can share this when we share the deck with the audience later, is a great place to start. Even if you right, you still have to go in and manually do it. They do have the actual scoring if you want to go build your own little algorithm on it. But it's a great place just to get into that mindset of saying, oh, something is medium for confidentiality risk. Let me pretend I care a high amount about confidentiality. And that'll reprioritize it. Obviously, this is where that tenet of automation and orchestration comes in. Tools do help in this, but you can't deploy the tools, right? We're all in the development world, right? We start with people. That's the cultural component. Process, that's what we're talking about here with our software development lifecycle, and then the tools. So as long as you think about it from that process perspective first, and then choose what tools you want to implement, but that is where you do the emerging space of application security orchestration, then is coming up in CI/CD security. That will really help you develop a more mature program. But where you want to start is with the tools that will grow as you grow. Continuous security isn't just about responding to those external and internal changes. You need something that's going to enable you to make changes both to your DevOps strategy and your security strategy to mature it. And that goes back to that first question as well, right? You do not need to have a fully baked DevOps deployment to be able to have continuous application security. I'll take one more question here. Okay. So we're going to go back to this stat. About 48% of organizations regularly pushing vulnerable code, and they know it, right? So this goes back to the how can I prioritize my vulnerabilities? Organizations are pushing vulnerable code, and it's not malicious. The top reasons that they often they cite are that they actually think that code's not vulnerable to them. They think that they have a delivery timeline and they haven't been given adequate time to do that, or that they just don't have a way to understand how to remediate that in an appropriate way. And this goes back to the process, right? So one, understand what that vulnerability means, not just to your company, but to your project, right? Is that a vulnerability, think of the reverse. If this vulnerability gets accessed, right? What's the implication to us, right? Are we talking about an Equifax size breach and a SolarWinds size breach? Or are we talking about some downtime? The second is, you do need to enable people, right? That the stats are that for every one security manager, there's 100 developers and 10 ops people. And we're not going to change that, right? Security is its own SME. We also, and this is, I think part of the myth of the developer-led security movement, we're not asking them to become security experts either. We need to find a way to deliver, bite-sized application security. Here's what you need to know now. That can be both from just telling them what the policy is and what the control is for it, right? Just think of it, coding practice and test plan. And down to like even providing, access to your learning modules, right? We have a partner we work with where in an upcoming upcoming release, we'll be able to link to a very specific e-learning tool so somebody can actually understand not just why they have to do it, but how to actually successfully do it. And so that starts to enable people to not just be making, Kentucky windage guesses about their vulnerability posture, but to actually make educated decisions and have the confidence that they've made decisions in line with what their overall cybersecurity strategy is. Application security in that tool-based approach has become very reactionary. This allows us to be that process flow, and having continuous security as part of your DevOps pipeline. It enables you to be proactive and, more importantly, make educated decisions and to make educated decisions about accepting risk. Thank you, as always, for joining us. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.